If you're a regular listener to the show, you've probably heard us talking about gene editing technology, Gene. It's got some scientists very excited around the globe. And it's got some conservationists excited too, because the technology could one day wipe out entire pest species if you decided that's what you wanted to do with it. But there are consequences. The Sustainability Council is warning that gene editing technology offers the power to deliver extinction to order on species like possums, but warns what happens if it gets into protected possum populations in Australia. The Council's Executive Director Simon Terry wants tougher international regulation. He joins us on the line now. Hey there, Simon.
Good afternoon.
What got you motivated to think about this?
New Zealand needs to take part in a discussion on what the international rules are going to be with the technology that, as you point out, has the power to deliver effectively extinction to order for species, and these can be species in the wild. The international regulation for this is inadequate, and so if New Zealand is considering using this technology domestically, we need to be very mindful of how that could spread to other places. And as a nation that's suffered more than its share of biosecurity incursions that have caused big problems, we need to be thinking about it coming back the other way, where something that's released overseas, not necessarily intended to go far from those shores, does end up with us. And what is a pest somewhere else may be something of importance to our farming systems or our ecology.
How does the technology work?
It drives a particular gene through a population so that the gene is passed down virtually every time through the generations. And if that gene is one triggering infertility, for example, then the theory is that the entire population can eventually be wiped out. So it's basically a way to leapfrog natural laws of inheritance. And if the theory proves up, that would be a very powerful tool needing very serious regulation.
As I understand it, they haven't mastered it yet. They've got the theory right. I think I read about something a couple of weeks ago where they'd done their first test on mammals and it had been a bit of a flop.
Yeah, it's still early days. The fruit flies experiments have also shown up resistance, where after a few generations the organism fights back and starts to try and discipline the introduced gene. But yeah, the first mouse experiment is underway, and we actually had a consortium which was backed by US Defence Department money scouting around New Zealand to see if there was a suitable island to do a first outdoor trial on eradicating gene-drive mice. So whether it's arising through New Zealand deliberately releasing to eradicate species here or tests somewhere else, this technology is moving very fast, and the calls from the US National Academy of Sciences on down is this needs to be internationally regulated right from the start.
Why does it matter if we're doing things here in New Zealand or if you're doing things on an island? I mean, it's a pretty good way of containing species, isn't it?
Yeah, New Zealand government officials put that argument up last year, but the responses that have come in as people study this increasingly are that an island doesn't give you the sort of sanctuary you'd like. For example, the possums are regarded as a pest here, but in Australia they're a protected species, and if we wanted to and could launch something targeting eradication of possums in New Zealand, the Australian Academy of Sciences believes that such a possum would eventually end up on its shores, and if you got enough of them, then they could face extinction of a species they value. And so the ramifications of this are beyond the domestic, and our motivation in producing this report was to draw attention to this international dimension and the need for New Zealand to participate in bringing forward proper international regulation.
Not being funny, but how's a possum going to get from New Zealand to Australia?
People asked us that 2 years ago when we first started raising this, and now that the Academies of Sciences have come out and talked about this, and also the inventor of the technology, Kevin Estfeldt, the MIT professor who first proposed using this for conservation biology, he's now done a very public recant and said that the form of gene drive that he was talking about first, he would be very much advising against using it in the wild, one that had no restriction on how many generations that trait could be passed through, because he says it would only take a few individuals and this thing could go global. So I think if you want to take that question up seriously, you take it to the scientists who are now saying it wouldn't take many for this to happen.
I mean, swimming, rafting, canoeing, how are the possums going to make the trip over the Tasman? It seems like very foolproof, doesn't it?
I don't think you need to go back very far in New Zealand's history to look at other ways things happened. Remember, the rabbit Courtesy virus was banned here, but a farmer somewhere, it's presumed, decided of their own volition to bring across the virus to have a go at rabbits, and that was how it came here. It doesn't always rely on natural migration, and we've seen examples recently also with the Fukushima tidal wave, where the US suddenly found an enormous variety of new species showed up by what was called tidal wave rafting after the impact of that particular event.
What sorts of species ended up in the US?
I don't have the details on that, sorry.
No,
but
I'm just
it was
saying
an example of
because Courtesy virus you can put in your pocket, can't you? But you'd have a bit of trouble convincing a possum to hide in your pocket while you took a flight to Australia. I guess rats would be different, right? Because if rats can stow away on ships, that would be fairly easy to travel from one country to another.
Rats have certainly proven themselves pretty able to migrate, and I think stoats would come in that department too. Quite how possums would do it, we'll leave to imagination. But the principle is that something like this, if it only takes a few individuals to start a chain reaction in another population, then the ethics of this, which are already, very serious in terms of deciding to wipe a particular population from a country, let alone globally, it becomes a global question if the technology effectively is intended to spread and its capacity is to spread globally.
What do we have already in the way of regulation? Anything?
Under the Biodiversity Convention is something called the Cartagena Protocol. That's specifically dedicated to the transboundary movement of genetically modified organisms that are living. It was, of course, set up with the idea that it would cover what was known at the time to be predominantly trade in agricultural GMOs, GM food. And so it was about the deliberate and intentional shipment of these GMOs, and it gave countries within the agreement the ability to say we want to be informed in advance of anything is going to be exported to us, and on the first instance we'll have the opportunity to risk assess it and turn it away if we don't like it. It did allow for what it calls unintended transfer, but it wasn't really contemplating this kind of a mechanism where if you released something in one country that it would just run wildfire and spread across the border that way. And so the only obligation someone signed up to the Cartagena Protocol would have is to notify another country that this might or has crossed the border.
Okay, so a good time to be talking about it now before this thing is actually perfected, right, and get all the countries signed up to it so that any use of this gene drive technology is done legally and with the agreement, presumably, of other countries. Whose responsibility would it be to sort of draft this sort of protocol? Is it the UN or what?
Well, the way these things often emerge is individual countries might take a leadership role and bring it to the attention of the UN forum. As it is, the Biodiversity Convention just a month ago was hosting quite intense meetings around this at its technical science level. The issue is very live, and it then comes down to a question of how much appetite is there internationally and politically for people to bite the bullet and sign up to something binding. Where you've got some countries like the US in particular, which is the home of biotechnology and where the patents for this live, it's been very reluctant to sign to such agreements in general. It doesn't even belong to the Biodiversity Convention, which is a standout amongst 179 other countries. So getting countries firstly to be willing to agree and come to some rules, particularly around liability and responsibility for prior informed consent, this technology really pushes the boundaries, and yet at the same time, the boundaries in terms of getting people to agree to good regulation, but at the same time, if you are an individual, an entrepreneur even, not necessarily even a government, and decide that something's a pest and want to apply this, it's not clear what sanctions you'd face specifically at the moment. And yet the consequences could be great, which is one of the reasons the military is taking a lot of interest in it and is currently the prime funder of it.
Hey, thanks for your thoughts on this. Simon Terry, Sustainability Council Executive Director. Really nice to chat to you today. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Jesse.